All right, before you rock and roll with this lecture here, you want to go back and get your responses to the thought experiment about skepticism and knowledge that you did right at the beginning of this thought primer. Because what we're going to do is we're going to look at how you evaluated all the different statements in that thought experiment to see if patterns emerge that might give us an indication of your attitude towards particular kinds of topics and whether or not you can have knowledge about these kinds of things. All right, so the first 4 sentences that come your way in this thought experiment are all propositions about God, and they're about religion and about the supernatural, okay? And it's really important for this to be useful that you score each one of these propositions correctly, okay? So when you look at a sentence like, there is a God, and you have an immediate reaction of, I think that's true, I agree with that, you'd score that a 1. You would also score it a 1 if you heard that sentence, there is a God, and you thought, that's false. There is no God. I'm really confident about that. You'd also score that a 1. If you look at that sentence, though, and you think, I know that it is true or false that there is a God. I don't know whether it's true or false, but I think I could know. I think that maybe at some point I will have knowledge about whether or not God exists. Then you'd mark that a 2. I'm open to the possibility that I could know whether or not this statement is true or false, whether I should agree with it or disagree with it, but I don't yet know. Okay, you'd score that a 2. Now, if you look at that sentence, though, and you say, oh my gosh, that is a sentence that we will never know definitively is true or false. We can't know. It's sort of it's an answer to an unanswerable question. So this is something where knowledge is impossible for us to have. We will never know whether or not the statement, there is a God, is a true or false statement. You'd mark that as a 3. And you want to do that for each one of these, right? So that you have a score attached to the statement that reflects your confidence in whether or not you have or can have knowledge of that statement's truth or falsity. Okay? And when you've done that for each one of these statements, add them up. And when you add them up, if you total somewhere in the 4 to 6 range, that's an indication that when it comes to questions about God or the supernatural, you're pretty confident that you have knowledge about these things. Now, if you're in the 4 to 6 range, though, that doesn't indicate what you actually believe. It just indicates an attitude towards this particular topic and whether or not you can have knowledge of it. If you looked at all 4 of these sentences and you responded to each one by saying, yes, I agree, that's a true statement, you would have scored all of these a 1. So you could be a very committed believer, be very confident in your knowledge of God and the supernatural, and come out with a score of 4. On the other hand, you could have looked at each one of these statements and immediately responded by saying, oh my gosh, that's false for all 4 of these statements. In which case, you would also come up with a score of 4, but you'd be at the exact opposite end of the belief spectrum. Now you're, instead of being a committed believer, you're probably more in the atheist range, okay? But what that 4 to 6 score is telling you is that when it comes to topics related to God and the supernatural, you feel like you're pretty confident that not only is knowledge possible, but that you actually have some of that knowledge. Now, if on the other hand you scored between 7 and 9, that's an indication that you do believe that knowledge is possible with regard to these 4 statements, but you're not quite confident you have that knowledge yet. Maybe someday you will, maybe someday somebody else will, but you're not feeling totally confident that you yet have that knowledge. You're open to the possibility. So you're not a skeptic, okay? You don't believe that knowledge of these topics is impossible. But if you scored 10 to 12, you're a skeptic. And what that means is you don't think that it is possible for us, or at least for you, to ever attain knowledge that would allow you to determine whether or not these statements are true or false. Okay? So it's just giving you an indication about what your attitude is towards knowledge about God and the supernatural, the afterlife, and so forth. Now you want to make sure you mark these sentences here, related to science, in a similar way. Each one of these statements is sort of describing or asserting that science has a particular kind of power to bring us knowledge, to collect knowledge and information about reality. And so when you look at these, again, you want to think really carefully about how you assign a point value to them. So you look at that first sentence, science gives us the best information about reality. All right. If you read that statement and your initial reaction is, that's true, I do believe science gives us the best information about reality, you'd score that a 1. If, on the other hand, you read that and you have this response of, that is not true, I think meditation or spiritual practices give us the best information about reality, then you'd also score it a 1, because you're very confident that that is not a true sentence. If, on the other hand, you look at that sentence and you say, well, I don't know, science is this newfangled shiny toy that's only been around for a few hundred years. I don't know if it gives us the best information about reality. Maybe it does today, but maybe there's a method for knowing that I'm not aware of that's just not as popular yet as science. Or maybe it's a method that hasn't been fully developed yet. So you're opening yourself up to the possibility that, well, this sentence could be either true or false. I'm just not entirely confident I know enough to determine whether or not it's true or false. And finally, if you look at that sentence and you think, oh, wow, that is a really difficult statement to determine whether it's true or false, because I don't know that we can know anything about reality through science or anything else. And then you'd probably mark that as a 3, because you're saying, there's no way for me to know if this sentence is true or false. Okay, so I'm going to mark it as a 3. And again, you'd add up your scores. And if you're in that 4 to 6 range, that's an indication that you're pretty confident in your beliefs about what kinds of knowledge or power science has to bring us information about reality. Okay, so again, though, it doesn't really indicate what your specific position is. You could have scored all of these a 1 because you believe all of these statements are true. And so that would make you a pretty firm believer in the power of science. But you also could have marked all of these a 1 because you believe every single one of these statements is false. You're sort of a science denier, but you're really confident that all of these statements are false. Okay, and then again, if you're in that 7 to 9 range, that's an indicator. I just haven't made up my mind on this yet, but I think it's possible to know whether these sentences are true or false. And if you're in the 10 to 12 range, that's you just saying, like, we can't know the answer to these things. This is all speculative. I am very uncomfortable saying that I will ever have knowledge that allows me to determine whether or not these statements are true or false. And of course, you do the same thing for these questions about moral knowledge. What your score is here is going to indicate your attitude towards moral knowledge and whether or not this is something that people can possess or that you can possess. So if you scored a 4 to 6, maybe that's because you're really confident that moral knowledge is attainable. Or maybe it's an indicator of your confidence that you believe that moral knowledge is not attainable, but it's sort of indicating your orientation to the possibility that moral knowledge is possible for us to have. If you find yourself in that 10 to 12 range, then you're essentially saying, like, this is something we'll never know. We can't know whether or not particular experiences have intrinsic value. We can't know if a particular action is objectively right or objectively wrong. These are just questions that we'll never be able to answer. And that's how if you're in that 10 to 12 range, you're skeptical about the idea that anybody could really have moral knowledge. They could have moral beliefs, perhaps, or they could have attitudes. But this idea of a true justified belief about moral issues, if you're in the 10 to 12 range, you're skeptical that we could ever have moral knowledge. We could ever have ideas about morality that are true, justified, and things that we believe. All right, so all this is doing is it's giving you a kind of a window to how you are situating yourself towards the possibility of particular kinds of knowledge.